Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 20. If you were to ask why the Seleucids did not rouse against the grievous assault they were victim to, it was for reasons I have already begun to establish. It was because of Ennaeus and the Bactrians. When news of the ritual in Judea crossed the great deserts and rivers of the east, called Mesopotamia as a whole, the shocking news entered empty courts and armories. The Seleukid host was marching east of the mountains that bisect their territory, Zagros, where there was wealth, security, and solace from the world, and moreover the promise of a quick victory and a return to the west. In the latter months of 170, the Grand Army had finished assembling and departed along the trade road that went north and then east, which would bypass the rough terrain of Old Persia and quickly bring Seleukid might to bear on the southern Hyrcanian Ocean, where Ampelios and Ennaeus stood as the only barrier to the downfall of the Bosporans and their allies here. Ennaeus had not been so naive as to presume a test of this kind was not destined to visit him, and his preparations had been quiet and cunning. When you consider his position, you may think that preparation was a waste of effort. After all, his fief city was ringed with high walls, richly towered and deeply sank into the earth, and it would not be simple for any to make demands of those inside, not without another Alexander. But this junior view was not correct. The fine walls were only the product of long-standing wealth, and long-standing wealth was the product of aversion to warfare. The mix of Parthians, Medes, Persians, and Greeks who lived behind those walls were not well placed to profit from war because they had never led their city themselves. Always it had been under the dominion of another city or a court that commanded many soldiers elsewhere. Ennaeus understood then that the reason he had come to rule this city on behalf of the Bosporan Empire was the very same reason that his citizens would throw open the gates the moment it seemed the Seleucids might cause trouble. There could be no siege of a city that refused to fight, and was too valuable to kings to worry about a sack by common soldiers. Therefore the walls were to remain untouched, and the city needed to hear only of the Seleukid plans after they had already failed. Ennaeus was wise in these things, it seems, although others will happily argue that his strategy was far worse than bricking over his gates and taking his chances as an urban warlord. Here is what he did. There is a place 1,500 stadies west of Ampelios, where its sturdy merchant road passes close to a forest. Ennaeus brought his army here and had the forest cut down over the course of several weeks. With the lumber harvested, he built a large and ornate encampment that was impractical in many ways, ill-suited to battle. This was by his direct instruction. In particular, it had 6 grand entrances that were too wide to properly defend, and were spanned by long walkways above, so that they looked like gates to a city from an age before stone existed in the world. Yet there were stones in its structure, not on the outside or in the foundations, but stowed within the high places and shadows of these defences, seemingly to use in throwing over the sides had the defences been made with room to deploy soldiers upon them. Instead, the stones themselves were the sentinels, and Ennaeus had faith in stone more so than iron, which, while a little comical to most, could be said to be a view that those from better days than ours would have praised. Once his unusual camp was completed, Ennaeus built a second camp that was the absolute opposite, small, unassuming, concealed, and protected in a practical manner. This camp was where all valuables were kept in preparation for the upcoming ploy. The Seleukid Grand Army approached down the road only a few days after preparations for their arrival were completed, thus gifting Ennaeus freedom from supplying his force in this remote position for long. The army was led by Ampelios, and if you read Seleukid histories, you will know all about him. For our purposes, we need only know that he was to be credited with the Seleucids' survival in the prior decade against many uprisings, and he had never been defeated in any battle of any kind. His prestige was clearly on display. The Seleukid column had in its vanguard not riders but musicians, who blared horns even on the long empty roads with no one to announce their presence to. There were so many tall banners hung from the footmen's sarissæ that the whole thing looked like a hairy caterpillar crawling eastwards, and I believe this was supposed to strike awe into any who saw it. There may have been hillmen or travellers upon whom this effect was achieved, but Ennaeus and his entourage laughed at the surplus of linen and wood the enemy had brought, because it would only strengthen the Bosporan scheme. There were 2 days of negotiations before the battle. Ennaeus acted in a brash and ambitious manner, boasting that his camp was of higher quality and finer design than the Seleukid one. With this line of argument deployed, he had all the excuses he needed to show Ampelios his camp in person. Ampelios would have noted the wide gates and the lax atmosphere inside. Soldiers were laying about in the sun and whispering to each other as the upright strategos passed by. All this must have had the effect Ennaeus desired, which was to seem as weak and worthy of violent reproach as possible. For on the morning of the 3rd day, the Seleukid army came in its full number to attack the camp. First, Ennaeus went to his gates and put up a defence. Had this been done with serious intent of holding out, he would have been made to suffer badly. The Seleukids tore down palisades and attacked with their long pikes, from which the only escape was to retreat. Retreat is what the Bosporans did, making this nervous manoeuvre in the knowledge that it was what their commander had already ordered. There was fighting in the camp, during which most of the towers and gateways came to be set alight by one side or the other. As the Bosporans withdrew, they deliberately ran over their tents and scattered things all over the ground. This was not out of panic or to delay their pursuers, but because the tents were heavily stocked with incendiary materials. So then, the killing blow of the scheme fell. The Bosporans followed Ennaeus out of the easternmost exit of the camp, which the Seleukids, driven to a hasty and confident assault, had not sealed or set watch upon. As the Bosporans went, they mocked their hunters and threw flaming debris around to spread fires through their camp in an apparent act of suicidal desperation. But the fires spread rapidly and consumed the tents, the walls, the gates, and a number of men that is hard to know. The gates collapsed under the heavy load Ennaeus had placed on them, leaving piles of burning rubble that could not be traversed. The Seleukids could not leave the camp with anything like the speed with which they entered. Only a few gaps in the wall were free of flames, and all men pushed to get through these, while the rows of tents exploded and spat hot oil all about. Ampelios was among the carnage, not able to restore order. Thus the Seleukid army tore at each other's throats to be first to leave. Even when men were not immolated by the fires and escaped to safer pockets, the collective heat of the huge encampment ablaze forced them to throw off their armour, so that most of those who escaped alive did so with only their body and perhaps a scant few pieces of gear. Ampelios himself is said to have tried to lead his men towards a burning piece of palisade to push it over and grant a new avenue of escape, only to be struck on his face by a large segment of char. He was so horridly injured by this that he was made to wear a mask forever after. If you find this an indignity, perhaps it will be slight relief to know that his life in this state was to be short. After all who could had escaped the camp, Ampelios ordered that the Bosporans be pursued immediately. However, his officers could not locate their foe. This was aided by the smoke obscuring the area, and the heat of both the fire and the afternoon sun creating many mirages, especially close to the road. The Bosporans escaped the scene with a few hundred dead, many victim of their own scheme, and the Seleukids returned to their camp with thousands dead and thousands more weak, disarmed, and unable to think of victory against such a savage opponent. Ennaeus was triumphant, and knew well that since he had gone to the effort of cooking a fine meal, the next logical thing would be to eat it. Ampelios, hardly able to lead but impossible to replace, directed his army to march back west, their fanfare and pomp replaced with weeping and moans. Ennaeus came after them, even though his force was still smaller than Ampelios's, knowing that more could be done. The Bosporans harried the Seleukids for weeks. The Anthropophagi flocked as eagerly as the carrion birds to make daily strikes on the column's rearguard. Said rearguard would always form up in an orderly fashion and make a show of standing fast, but was fewer in number each time they returned to their march. The Seleukids came to slow down to the point that Ennaeus and company overtook them. This was likely because Ampelios was too injured to move far each day, and no one dared to go ahead of him or think that a new order might better suit the circumstance. Hence the circumstance came to be that one day they were blocked to their front by a line of Bosporan spearmen. Seeing this, Ampelios called for his vestments of war and sat upon a horse which was guided by 2 squires on foot, an Ampelian chariot I like to call it. He gave all the equipment to the best soldiers and positioned them at the front and rear of each company. Then he sent them to attack the Bosporan line. In the clash that ensued, the Seleukids made extremely good report of themselves, and I believe this is because they were so moved by Ampelion's bravery in this dire situation that they found the honour in battlefield death to be worth more than whatever else they might see if they were to simply desert or leave their commander to his fate. The Bosporans were made to fight for long hours to deplete even single ranks of the Seleukid bloc, and while Ennaeus does not say as much, the rumour is that more Bosporans were killed in these clashes than Seleukids by a wide margin, and there were more Seleukids to begin with too. The turning point in the battle came with the death of Ampelios. This achievement was taken up by the Anthropophagi, who whimsically arrived to the battle after resting their horses nearby. These riders were hardly under Ennaeus' control, and the more they succeeded, the greater this gulf grew. Ampelios saw these riders nearing, and took all of his companions to face them. This was folly, and arrows stabbed and cut at his group from all sides, while only few Lithosis were caught and made to face lance and sword in return. Having no particular battlefield etiquette, the Lithosis took no surrender and killed Ampelios as readily as any soldier. They did, though, understand the rewards on offer for this feat, and thus they beheaded the Strategos and presented the head, still in its silver mask, to Ennaeus. Ennaeus did not want to touch it and had an aide take it. He rewarded the Anthropophagi and asked them to help attack the remaining infantry. A few of them did. He returned to organizing the battle. However, he was set upon by a strange voice. It was the same voice he had heard so recently when he showed Ampelios around the false camp. It was the voice of Ampelios himself. We don't know what it said because only Ennaeus heard it, and he never wished to pass on the details. That this happened at all comes to us only from those who witnessed the odd things that happened here. Ennaeus is said to have gone away from the battle with his aide so that he could speak to Ennaeus, and after they returned, the battle was won, and Ennaeus was now holding Ampelios' head. Ennaeus was not the same after that day, and neither, I might add, was Ampelios. Returning to serious matters, the battle had been costly for the Bosporans, with a very large number of wounded to treat by the time all the Seleukids had been killed. None fled. The Seleukid camp followers were taken alive and made to help with the medical work and with the handling of the large amount of loot which the Bosporans had taken from the main camp after the initial battle. This sped up the army and allowed them to return to Hekatompelos in good time, although not quite before word of the invasion had reached the city, as Ennaeus had hoped. To summarize this clash, the Seleukids sent their best army and lost it to trickery that preyed upon their own sureness of victory, and their comportment was moved from braggartly to admirable over the course of many defeats, and never did they lose the chance to win by their own strength of character and skill at arms. Yet defeated they were, and that meant that while King Elector despaired to hear of what Dion and the Ptolemies were doing in Syria, he was set back so far that his barbaric enemies would have at least another year of leisure. This situation undermined him politically, and the nature of all the successor states to Alexander is that their royal legitimacy is easy to claim and quick to change hands, since it is not based especially strongly on bloodline. Elector became more concerned with preserving his life than his empire, thinking the former a goal within his power, and the latter one for which hope was lost. And so the Seleukid court fell into chaos, and their people's powerful fear and sense of injustice towards the invasions was made as futile as screaming with your head in a barrel of water. It was not the Seleukids who would save the remaining people of these lands, but a man we are familiar with already, Dorieus, prince and heir to the empire. His arrival brought about a change to the unfolding madness, stemming from his many kingly qualities, so it will be with great ease that I discharge my duties next in describing to you the prince's campaign of redemption. His party had taken over a year to travel from Macedonia to Syria, with several diversions along the way. This is because the size of his party continually increased on account of his reputation as a promising leader of the many hopeless people that abounded since the rise of the Romans, and finding ships and legal rites of passage became impossible. For this reason, the expedition went overland through Asia for much of the distance, where Dorieus stopped at each city to ingratiate himself with the local elites. The area was under the control of the king of Pergamon, and where this was not the case, Dorieus committed his soldiers to aid in the spread of his Bosporan satrap's domain. In exchange, he laid the foundations for many Scions of Gold temples, with mixed results. His final escapade of this kind was in Tarsus, which is a port controlled by the Ptolemies on Asia's southern edge. This is the same city that is sometimes called Antioch Kidnus, which is what the Seleukids called it before the Ptolemies gained the city in the conclusive treaty of a prior war. Since this led to much confusion, being that a more important city of the same name was in close proximity, the Tarsites wisely had the law altered to return to their traditional name. They claim today that the name Tarsus stems from a Golden Age paragon who was struck by lightning and killed when the city's first stone was laid, and hence was worshipped as a deity for a time, although there are no such stories from earlier times to confirm it, and lithosis records are too far removed to have such a paragon officially recorded, as far as I have found. In this wealthy city, the Scions of Gold had already begun to enlighten the local population. They had found success for two material reasons. First, in the previous decades, there had been a mass burglary of works stored in the city library. This library was famous in scholarly circles for containing many works concerning a people called the Hittites, who were prevalent in Asia before the time of the Trojans, meaning they were the first organized state to emerge after the chaos of the Cosmos Wars that ended the Golden Age. This fame caught the attention of the Greeks in Alexandria, because there a similar museum of important works was being kept. When Tarsus was made a satrapy of House Ptolemy, the library was pilfered for its best pieces without delay. Promises had been made that every work would be transcribed into new books, and then the originals could be returned. That, inevitably, was more expensive than reneging and ignoring all complaints, leaving the Tarsus library bare. A number of donations and recent fines had begun to alleviate this pitiful void, and then began the mass transcription of Scions of Gold records at Ampelios. Copies of these records, which mostly detail things I have also included in this work, were used as diplomatic gifts in some cases, or were imposed upon various collections around the Bosporan world through bribes and private arrangements. The exact details of these were not recorded, with the same care to avoid doing so as was taken in ensuring other things were recorded at length. The Scions of Gold are mysterious in this way, but we have a clear window into what they were really like, because we have their foremost member as our current protagonist, Dorieus. He was raised with the first generation of settled lithosis, as were most of the leading religious officials attached to government business, due to the simple rule that Chariskos was where these officials were trained and housed in the time before Ampelios began to share that work. And since Chariskos was so isolated, almost all of the officials had to be drawn from the city itself. Being a brand new city, filled with people who were not especially ingrained to the traditional ways of the various lands they had left, except the lithosis you could say, the Scions of Gold that emerged from this generation were quite sacrilegious and zealous, if the usual critiques of them to be found elsewhere are to be put tersely. Dorieus was more measured since he was educated in the Greek style, yet this comes hand in hand with having greater foresight and ambition for achievement as a leader. And so, there in Tarsus, he paid for scribes to translate the Scions of Gold's works into several languages and ensured that many copies in Greek were available. Then, in an often praised stroke, he gave a stipend to the library so that they would retain an orator to give voice to the truth of Manos to any who wished it. Even slaves were encouraged to learn where the world had come from, since even the smallest everyday action has a different spirit when you know what role it plays in the holistic scheme of salvation from the gods. That is what people say on this matter anyway. The second and more material advantage the Scions of Gold enjoyed was that the people of the mountains and valleys the city served were the best cattle breeders in Asia, and the rediscovery of the use of cattle sacrifice for everyday purposes had enacted a boom in the city's prospects. Furthermore, Egyptian religion had not entirely forbidden this, so the full and proper practice from the Golden Age returned here swiftly and peacefully. The problem they faced was that unscrupulous officials were levying increasingly bitter portions of the hoard for their own use, and it is the case that if only people with particular interests are employing the power of the natural order of the world, and only renewing the parts of life which pertain to the power of the strong over the weak, then disorder becomes an automatic result. This is because common people wish the world to be lawful and ordered out of fear of what others might do to them, while powerful people wish the world to be disordered and full of opportunity for them to inflict their power upon others, likewise fearing being returned to the plight of their would-be victims. It has always been like this, but with the strength of gold returning to humanity, differences like this became more important. These are the sorts of high-minded matters that Dorieus concerned himself with at all times, with the dutiful approach of his uncle Spartacus merging fruitfully with the eye for exploit of his father Pyrrhusades. In this case, he interjected himself into the city's politics with great force, being present at all courts and councils to voice his concerns, keeping his large army, albeit mostly of civilians, encamped outside the city. Eventually it was agreed that a law be made with the power to grant all citizens the boons of sacrifice, to eliminate levies on materials that were useful for rejuvenating the world, and for individuals who purchase cattle to be barred from the markets for 1 month hence, so that they might not influence the supply to others. I believe that Dorieus had further impositions he wished to make. However, around the time this was happening, there came news from Antioch, which is the nearest city to Tarsus, both being close to the junction of Asia and Syria. It was news of what I have already described, the news of mass death. These events brought about a change in Tarsus too. First, the people were terrified that the Ptolemies would come and enact slaughter upon them too. This fear was heightened by a blockade which the local military force made on the eastern road, not permitting travel by land to or from Syria. This inconvenienced Dorieus, who had resolved to go to Antioch immediately. Instead, he was made into a magistrate of sorts, because the fearful people of Tarsus were now turning to him for reassurance. His reputation in this department was, in my opinion, greater than was warranted. Yet the cultivation of hope for sagacious leadership is common when the fundamentals of everyday life become uncertain. On one occasion, a rowdy crowd had gathered on the hill within the city where there were many rich households and temples, and the city leaders were at a loss for how to disperse them. Dorieus came into the city once again and addressed the people, saying, "This world is made from the same things as we, and we from the world. When you live a long and virtuous life that is filled with righteous behavior, you experience the life that Manos intended for us, to be alive and possess freedom of thought in a land that is not beset and ravaged by the gods at every moment, as the cosmos generally is. That is why we Bosporans say that death is good, for in your return to the world grows and strengthens with all the power you bore, like a forest giving birth to a fleet of 1,000 ships. What the Alexandrians are doing is not the correct way. One can spill blood to summon goodness where evil is great, and one can use evil blood to do good. These things are true. For all I have heard, this is not what your masters have done. They have disordered the world such that any magic they achieve through it will not undo the damage. They will not do this to you. I will never allow it. I condemn the monsters who arrange this, be they of my own kin or not. And I say to you, remember that there is never enough knowledge, never enough truth, never enough calm, and never enough virtue to go around, because we remain yet cursed in this way. Heed me, and know that this will not be so forever. I vow to go and make this right. Although I was sent here to war and conquer, I see that it is salvation these lands need. Listen well to what you will be told, and know evil when you see it, no matter the face it shows you. let us be to our business, friends, and I will away to mine, so that when you die, it will be after everything you ever needed to do is concluded, and a return to the tripartite's quiver will be a welcome and deserved reward." These words were successful in calming the crowd and earning the prince yet more followers. He was so popular in the city that the nobility wished to see him gone quickly, knowing that he was likely to further meddle in politics and cause them trouble. To achieve this, a large donation of ships and supplies was offered so that Dorieus' party could speed off to their business in Antioch. However, the number of people from Tarsus who volunteered to join his army was very large, preferring to be close to the man who had promised to protect them than to live in a city under the crunching thumb of Ptolemy XII. Therefore, the actual transfer of people from Tarsus to Antioch took several months. Let us go with Dorieus in the leading ships to see what he did in Antioch. After an uneventful voyage of 4 days, the prince set eyes upon the city. Smoke beckoned them over the horizon and into the royal docks even months after the sacking. Since then, the city had been occupied by all manner of rogues. Dorieus scattered them with his arrival and began taking inventory. As he had been informed, the city was without people, although some in truth were still there in small numbers, living on the scraps of what was left. He had expected to find officers under the Ptolemies he could reprimand, but nay. The fleets which had taken the docks had already returned to Alexandria, or been employed in Dion's ritual, and the army this fleet had ferried, along with the troops used to ensnare and slaughter the Antiochian army nearby, had received marching orders and gone away. The local people gave indication of where they were going, east, towards the next large city in Syria, Edessa. When it became clear that Dorieus was not in favour of the crimes that had been carried out, people begged him to go and save Edessa from like treatment. Dorieus wrote of this that he had discounted the fears of these people, who could not have helped but to have had their senses robbed from them alongside their lives and futures. This shows that his faith in the reason of the Ptolemies, of a justification to be salvaged, remained upright. Because of this, he did not employ much haste, and that is reasonable, I think, if both his misgivings and the vast amount of other tasks presenting themselves are considered. Any justifications we might give, though, will bring no solace to the people of Edessa, for reasons we shall attend to in due time. For the remainder of 170 prior, Dorieus began the process of rescuing the city. This was possible to do extremely quickly because of the flow of his hangers-on providing colonists, and most were overjoyed to take up residence in a city that, while destroyed, still had its favourable position to leverage for rich fishing, shipping and caravanning. There was no reason the city could not become as wealthy as it was again, everyone said, if Dorieus could only protect them. Many messages were sent to Asia, Greece and Odrysia to have families and friends alerted to the opportunity. Likewise, people from Syria came and told of looting and sacking taking place not far to the east. Dorieus dispatched parties to investigate this and bring the refugees into the city. He could not have gone out in force to do anything more substantial, for guarding the city and performing labour entirely consumed his money and manpower for the time being. His duty was pulling him in every direction, and I am sure you have seen a contest of rope pulling that demonstrates how equal and opposite efforts produce sweating and straining without any movement. Here it was not sweat but blood falling all around him, and Dorieus came to understand that his father, the king, was not in control of the fate of the world, as he had naively believed for much of his life. It is easy for those with a golden age view of kings to have these mistaken thoughts, but alas, Dorieus lived not in a golden age yet. More volunteers were taken from the south. After they pledged allegiance and signed terms of colonial service to the empire, Dorieus heard the multitude of things that were being said of Prince Dion in the region. Some had escaped from Tyre, where Dion was keeping the entire city as slaves so that he could profit from their maritime business, but where also he was considered a great man who had saved the city from Antioch's even more horrid fate, in defiance of the Ptolemies. Others came from Judea and brought mixed stories of a dedicated servant of the High Lord who also brought about apocalyptic devastation with a face that showed neither anger nor glee. Dorieus needed to wipe doubt away and know what his father's empire was coming to. Hence he commissioned a small ship to take him and his selected companions to Tyre. He recorded a heartening experience, seeing how quickly that city had recovered from its sacking, although this was a material assessment only, for the people were miserable. Noting that most of them were women and young men, Dorieus proposed an alliance of sorts with Antiochia, where women and children were in short supply, and the idea appealed to many. However, they were not a free city, and it was agreed that the matter should be decided by Dion. Confident that this would not be difficult to achieve, Dorieus next sailed on to Palestine. For what happened upon his arrival, I invite you to read this passage from his own recollection. The people at the shore displayed an upsetting mix of scorn and reverence, and we all agreed that we should leave the ship under guard and walk together with our minds ever latched upon our arms and the chance of their sudden need. We procured small horses at great expense, for there was no alternative, and furthermore, it seemed that the money was so precious to the local people that they might have gone to violent lengths to seize it from us if we did not agree to their terms. It was more desperate a place than I had ever seen. This remained true only for that day, for then we saw what was happening in the city. Outside, we were perplexed by the so-called orchards of life, which is what the rumours had called them. They were as we had heard them described, that being rows of wooden posts set up in places that had once been farmers' fields. There were people here and there picking things out of the soil who stared at us with unknowable intent. I was even more upset than before, and wished our horses were stronger and faster. The city did not have a stable we could use, so I decreed that we should take the horses all the way to the inner complex that Prince Dion used as a court. The city was mostly in a state of decay and ruin, and this was Dion's doing, as we already knew. More recently, he had blockaded certain districts with piles of bricks to demark areas where diseases lay in wait, and I thought that I was witnessing another world to wander through such a place. It was as if the city itself was ill and elderly, or even the world and its soil, and it seemed impossible that the things we had heard about Dion championing the people who lived here could be serious claims. At last we reached the hilltop temple where his soldiers were stationed, and we could be relieved of a measure of our anxiety. The temple was beautiful and quiet, despite being crowded with people. I was not recognized and had to explain myself many times to various people before a meeting with Dion was possible. I went to a lower chamber of the temple, where the commoners were not allowed to go, and Dion received me there in a small court he had manufactured from a collection of heirloom furnishings. He looked as I remembered him from our youth, and he did not think that of I, as he said at once in his rude manner. He went on with this lack of reverence, and when I challenged him on it, he scoffed and began to list his many military achievements. I was able to confirm some with reports I had received from others. He was very proud of what he had done, and so I was compelled to carry the momentum of the conversation into a challenge regarding the death and anguish that clouded the lands. Here he had pride too, and spoke of what darker things were due to happen before he had improved the course of events. As for the flaws that were clear, he had every excuse prepared. He had the confidence of a king who knew the world was as it should be, and all around him were men who agreed. Had I not been alerted of the perils abroad, I would have stayed there and played judge to so many matters that there would be no describing them in words. Alas, I was away that same day, for the darkness seeping from that underground throne needed vanquishing in places where hope yet remained. I guarded myself even closer after that day, knowing that my life was foundational to the Golden Age's return. Yes, perhaps as confidently as my cousin believed the same. I enjoy the candid style of Dorieus's diaries, for even though he had every chance to aggrandize the tale, he seemed to mention weakness and failure even in himself with convincing regularity. Dion, on the other hand, when he wrote of himself, used the power of a writer more forcefully. Dion always claimed that any and all crimes he was accused of were the responsibility of the Ptolemies and the Scions of Gold, since he was acting on their advice, or their order even. For most men this would be a passable if weak excuse, though for Dion it strikes closer to the heart of the matter, which I will contend is thus. Dion was raised in close adherence to the ways of the Spartacid dynasty, of the Bosporan elite from the pre-Empire times, and in particular to the commands of his father. These things were now absent from his life, and so just as animals raised by farmers often make mischief upon themselves and others when they escape, Dion was in another world that he was not moulded to fit. Dion's business was his own then, for Dorieus indeed left quickly as he hearkened to a call of people more in need even than the Judeans, and those were the Edessans. The hopeless predictions that he had cast off were all too correct. He took his soldiers out of Antioch in force to go east along the well-maintained roads, and all auspices taken indicated that something foul lay ahead. For instance, Dorieus personally encountered a way station that burned with a blue flame and emitted a dreary cry, and others said that there was a river nearby that collapsed through the ground and disappeared. These are only the most reliable of the signs the priests noted. The meaning of these signs will be obvious, so instead I will note something intriguing. Dorieus had priests and seers from all manner of religious schools among his entourage, and he enjoyed hearing what they all had to say. Since he had great influence over the most adventurous members of the Scions of Gold, he was able to imprint himself upon them in this regard, such that some of the Scions of Gold were well versed in how to placate the gods. This stands in contrast to the branch that was emerging through Dion's service to the Ptolemies, and to a lesser degree in other cities in the Empire, in which the gods were most straightforwardly overlooked and defied, in favour of a more rapid return of the tripartites' power. As I have said, these are debates that are not entered lightly. I would only like you to see that the seeds of the long-standing disagreements appear to have been germinating in the time of Dorieus and Dion's campaigns, and perhaps because of these campaigns. To conclude, with speed that completely undersells the weight of what happened now, I will report that Dorieus found Edessa had been treated in the same way as Antioch, only the deeds were just recently completed. It was the 3rd month of 169 prior when he conducted his survey of the scene. The Alexandrians were camped beside the city, and parties sortied from the camp at all hours to visit the towns and villages of the region. The enthusiasm of the common soldiers to enact the devastation of the region was something one does not want to think those of a great and civilized society could possess, yet I cannot faithfully write anything to the contrary. The spoils that were valuable to those men were stored in the camp, while those which were the purported lot of the magicians of the Bosporan Empire were scattered about the city in a disorganized manner. Seeing this, Dorieus did not want to go inside the walls for fear of disease. Since the Alexandrians had not moved on, nor completed their work, the prince could at least take command of the rogue campaign through the powers Spartacus had imbued in the Spartacid bloodline through treaty, and I am pleased to say that the worst of the crimes were set to end because of this. The consequences of them, though, were barely beginning to be felt.